Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi. To a banner review video for Arlecchino's banner and Lyney's rerun banner. First things first, I looked at the feedback on the last banner review video and it was pretty overwhelmingly positive. I think I'll stick to both longer banner review videos and shorter meta roundup videos. But yeah, let's get right into it. First off is the 5 stars, and obviously if you want in-depth analysis on Arlecchino, you should watch the pre-release video. Now, a couple things that have changed as of today, which is when we got the preload, right? We got the pre-game installation, the pre-patch installation thing as of recording this just today. There's a few changes to Arlecchino that are not really number changes. They're giving her more resistance to interruption during her elemental skill, so she can't get staggered out of her elemental skill as easily. During her special charge attack, which straight up does not matter because her special charge attack is an exploration mechanic, and when are you getting staggered during exploration? But I mean, I guess it's probably annoying if you like get shot by a hilly troll and then like while you're trying to hover over water and then you just fall in the water and you're just sitting there like an idiot. But I get it. It's a nice change, but it's not really impactful for her strength. They're also buffing the interruption resistance from her C1. I don't know if they went back and forth or if I just received conflicting information between infinite resistance to interruption during normal attacks and just a certain amount of resistance to interruption. Right now it seems to have been changed to infinite again, so that's that. And there's also a potential change to C2 that gives her more resistance, like more physical and elemental resistance. Either way, like these are just slight changes to some constellations. Major change at C0 other than you can't get staggered out of your skill, which is nice but not that relevant. I guess as someone who complains about Rosaria's skill all the time, I should be happy with this because at least it's not going to happen with Arlecchino. But it's much longer cooldown, so it generally shouldn't happen to begin with, right? You only use it once, maybe twice per rotation, and you use it at the start of your rotation, which is generally before the enemies have had time to start hitting you. Anyways, outside of that, I don't think I've changed my mind on anything else in the pre-release. A very quick rundown for those of you that haven't watched it and that just want information about her. She's going to be a relatively strong unit. She's not going to be meta-defining, but she'll definitely have her strength. She's a unit that has pretty strong early constellations. So for people that like to vertically invest into characters to save up their primos, to go for a specific 5-star they really like, Arlecchino will perform pretty well with her C1 and C2. Her C1, C2, and C3 are all fairly good cons. You can decide to get any of them, right? You can decide to stop at C1 and it's a fine stopping point, stop at C2, stop at C3, whatever. Definitely don't go for C4 if you're not planning to go all the way to C6 though, because C4 is kind of ass, and C5 is not that great either. Other than that, she's going to be a unit that is potentially hard to make work for people that get hit by a lot of attacks. I think for most people, she's going to end up being played in teams that have strong defensive utility options because she cannot be healed. So units like Xiangling, units like Xingqiu that have strong defensive utility will help her perform a lot better. That being said, she doesn't have specific animation cancels that she needs to do most of her damage. She does have animation cancels that she can do, but the difference between using them and not using them isn't that big, and you're not going to get punished for not doing them. You're not going to get punished for having to dash out of incoming attacks, stuff like that. So if you're someone who struggles with like jump cancels on Hu Tao, for example, this isn't going to be a character that punishes you for stuff like that. Other than that, right, if you want any more information, make sure you go watch the pre-release video. Now for Lyney. Lyney's a very interesting character. I think there's a lot of people that think Lyney's really, really good, and there's a lot of people that think Lyney's awful. I'm personally more somewhere in the middle. He's a character that, under the right circumstances, is going to actually be very strong. But he's also a character that is reliant on the right circumstances to get the most out of him. And when you're in the wrong circumstances, he is not nearly as strong. When everything goes right with Lyney, he is one of the best carries in the game. He has good front-loaded damage. He has strong overall DPS. He's actually pretty damn good. But his best teams don't use resistance to interruption. They don't use strong defensive units that prevent you from being staggered. And if you do have to use those options, his teams get a lot worse. Like, I think that he has much worse synergy with many of the defensive options that work in his teams than a character like Arlecchino, for example. Where I think in Arlecchino's teams, Well, obviously it depends on which team, but in like the Vape teams, for example, you're not sacrificing as much for better defensive options as you are in the Lyney teams. Lyney's a character that sees a lot of play for like low constellation speedrunning with good reason. Because again, right, he front loads his damage, and when things go right, he's actually very strong. And in speedrunning, you can reset until things go right. That being said, when you're playing him in teams that have defensive options, he's not nearly as strong. And when you're playing him in teams that don't have defensive options, right? If you lose one of your charge shots because you have to dash out of an incoming attack or because you get staggered, his DPS completely tanks. I think he's a good example of like a high risk, high reward character. And he's very much a character that I don't recommend to people that don't enjoy the charge shot playstyle. I think he feels... As someone who doesn't like charge shot playstyle, he feels a lot better to play than a traditional charge shotter like Ganyu, because a lot more of his damage is done through his Xiangling burst. And even if you get staggered out of a charge attack, as long as you still use your burst into your skill, you'll still do a good amount of damage. It's just not gonna be like great anymore. If you are considering going for him, there's an interesting video by Jamie that I'll try to remember to link in the description that talks about his artifact sets and how Marichal won't actually always be his best set, because in a lot of situations, because his damage is so front loaded, you end up doing a lot of your damage before you actually stack up the 4-piece passive, and it makes it so that the 4-piece set isn't actually offering you as much as it quote-unquote should. Whenever you open your rotation with a burst, which, depending on what you're fighting, can actually happen, especially if it's like an AoE first wave into a single target second wave, you kind of want to use this burst to clear out the first wave and then start charge attacking on the second wave. Well, then you're not getting any of this crit rate from Marichal on the burst, right? Point being, he is a character that has a lot of min-maxing things you can do, obviously. For speedrunning, there's even more min-maxing. He's got some relatively good constellations if you want to go for like vertical investment to him. His signature weapon is pretty good on him, but bows actually have access to so many good options that you should just keep in mind. If you already have a 5-star bow, it's very possible that it's not that far behind his signature. All in all, like my experience playing him, mine is not actually as... Like, mine isn't fully maxed out, obviously, as you've seen, he's level 80, not 90. But in my experience playing him, I felt like very often I end up losing out on 1 to 2 charge shots against very aggressive enemies. When that's the case, it feels like I'm just playing a shitty on-field pyro unit. Against less aggressive enemies that are more designed around stalling than they are around killing you, like the Lynette, like the Rune Serpent, or enemies that are kind of just HP sponges, like the Primo Vishat, like the Aeon Blight Drake. Generally, I don't lose a charge shot at all, and Lyney feels great. There's also going to be a certain like investment threshold where you can start one-rotating bosses, and that's going to be a pretty big deal in specific matchups. So like, for example, my Lyney does not have enough damage because he's not fully invested, and because I don't have the greatest artifacts, nor do I have his signature weapon. My Lyney's not like strong enough to be able to kill Simon in one rotation. Because of that, it goes invisible, and it's a huge pain in the ass because I have to wait a long ass time. Just like any unit that has a certain amount of front-loaded damage, if you are going to get to the damage threshold that are necessary to one-rotate content, they're going to feel a lot better than if you don't. And generally, it's harder to make that happen if you're someone who prefers to get a bunch of different characters over vertically investing into specific characters by getting maybe an early constellation or a signature weapon. I think overall, Lyney is, like, from a purely meta perspective, he's a unit that is pretty good for people that are interested in getting into speedrunning or that are interested into vertically investing into characters. I think that otherwise, he's a bit on the underwhelming side. That's it for Lyney. So now let's move on to the 4 stars on this banner. And honestly, that's gonna be where this banner is gonna lose a lot of you guys, I think. So we have Xiangling, Freminet, and Lynette. Xiangling is great. I don't think anyone is unaware of this by now. Xiangling is pretty damn good. That being said, you get her for free, and post Constellation 4, she doesn't really get better. Like, her C5 isn't completely useless, but it doesn't do that much. And her C6 is more of a constellation that's useful in teams where you use her as a support to give your on-fielder power damage than it is useful for her because she doesn't benefit from her own damage on Pyronado on her C6. Because of that, it means that you only really ever need 4 Xianglings for your account. And because she's available in the shop, because she's available through Lantern Rite, because honestly she's there on banners pretty often, I think a lot of people already have her C4. When that's the case, she becomes a unit that is just not very valuable to have on banner. What that means is that if you, personally, you watching this video, don't have Xiangling C4 and aren't repulsed by her so much that you'll refuse to play her no matter what, if that's you, then she's really good to have on a banner. Otherwise, not the greatest. The big issue with this banner, though, is not her. The real problem lies with the other 2 4-stars. I could say this more nicely, but I don't think it would convey how bad Freminet is if I didn't actually call him dog shit. Now, there are situations where he will work. At the end of the day, he is a physical unit that has a kit centered around synergy with Hydro, which means that you inherently are going to want to run him with Electro for Superconduct and Hydro for his passive that gives him more damage when he triggers Shatter. And then you have one last slot. And that last slot, Hydro Electro, you know it. Dendro, pretty pog. He's a unit that is inherently very synergistic with Hyperbloom. Even outside of Hyperbloom, if you have C6 Mika, he can function as a fine physical carry. That being said, he's just not very good. Finally, you have Lynette, who is somewhere in the middle. She's not a bad unit. The biggest problem with Lynette is that she's never really better than the other Animo units, which means that she's inherently a unit whose use case is you use her before you get yourself Sucrose, Kazuha, Xiangling, whatever, right? The problem is, because you get her for free, her being on a banner doesn't really help you because her constellations don't really make her that much better. And by the time you're, going on a banner, getting constellations on a character, you probably want to get some of the other animal units. Now, if you do get her C6, she's actually a pretty reasonable unit. She can be played as an on-fielder. And yeah, it's not really going to be as good as a lot of the other options, but it definitely is going to be good enough to clear stuff, right? The biggest problem with her is just that she's nothing really more than fine, and her constellations just don't do enough to really be that helpful. Now, if she wasn't given for free, I'd say that this is a pretty good beginner banner because you get an animal unit for VV, and you get Xiangling, and you get, if you go for Lyney, you get yourself a relatively strong Pyro core that's just missing Bena, right? If you go for Arlecchino, you can play Arlecchino in Mono Pyro as well, right? So you can do that with her too. Anyways, let's go through all 3 of these units' constellations individually. Lynette's C1 is not real. It says it does something, but it does not do anything. Technically, it does, but it's this is a French press, okay? It's made of glass and metal. If I blow on my French press really, really hard, I might be able to make it move a 1/10 of a centimeter. But wait, I can do this. That is what Lynette C1 does. That is the strength of her vortex, okay? And I remember, when she came out, we had a leak that said that her vortex is the same strength as Kazuha. And it's actually true. And this is where the 2 different ways that you can make enemies move come into play. You can knock enemies back, and you can suck enemies, right? What makes Kazuha good at grouping is that he has inward knockback followed by a long-lasting vortex of suction. Lynette's vortex from C1 is the same strength as the vortex that stays after you use Kazuha's E. Right? This suction that's pulling the Minotaur back in a little bit, Lynette has as well. That's keeping the hilly churls there, Lynette has as well. But she doesn't have that initial inwards knockback that Kazuha has. Does not mean, and more importantly, that vortex does not last as long as Kazuha's does. What that means is that in practice, her suction being as strong as Kazuha does not mean that she has real grouping. Her C1 is honestly kind of useless. C2 helps her application and her damage a little bit. C3, it's fine. C4 gives you 2 E-charges. It's a good exploration constellation. Fog. C5 is a little bit more damage as well. It's fine. And then C6 gives her an Anemo infusion that you can use to drive with her on field. All in all, her constellations, like the difference between C6 and C0 is there. The biggest difference between C6 and C0 is slightly more damage. Like if you do get Lynette at C6, you can use her as a plunge carry with Xiangling. Not going to be as good as the units that are actually designed around it, but it is going to work. And if you really like Lynette, it's a good way to make her actually function as a carry in a team. And yeah, I guess that's also something you can say about Freminet. I didn't mention earlier. Lynette's taunt is actually somewhat decent. The thing is that I think in most situations, taunts are just not good enough. But yeah. Feminet's C1, alright. C2 is fine. Decent. It's a little bit of energy. C3, normal attack talents. They're alright. C4, 18% attack, right? It's whatever. C5, skill damage. It's alright. C6, 36 crit damage. It's alright. All of his constellations are like fine. None of them are all that great. That being said, 6 fine constellations on top of each other is a pretty big difference between C0 and C6. When I talk about Freminet not being great, I think at C0 he's like unironically like he's truly worthless at C0. I think at C6 he can be fine in some situation, and I don't like that because like I've talked about it in the pre-release I did on him. I think his kit is really, really cool. I think he has a really interesting kit, and I think that whoever designed his kit popped the fuck off. But his numbers just aren't good. Anyways, at C6, if you also have C6 Mika, he can be a fine physical carry. His C3 giving him normal attack talents means that at talent level 10, it becomes talent level 13. If we look at Diluc, talent level 10, plunge multiplier, 442. We look at Freminet, talent level 13, plunge multiplier, 446. That's a little bit higher than Diluc. It is, I believe, currently the highest in the game. That being said, obviously, his Ascension stat is worse and his base attack is worse, so it's still not going to be as much damage. But it is at least, alright. So, like, you can use him as Xiangling. You can use him either as a physical carry with Xiangling or just with C6 Bennett. They're both alright. And then, finally, Xiangling. C1 is, I think, a bit better than people give it credit for. Back in the old days of Genshin Impact, in, like, 1.0, Abyss was whopper flowers and slimes and just shit that just spawned far from each other and wasn't very tanky. And so getting good uptime on this resistance reduction from Guoba was very unreliable. Nowadays, there's a lot more enemies that don't move a lot or that are tanky enough that, you'll be hitting them for a while. And it makes it a lot easier to get good uptime on her C1. And her C1 is actually pretty good. It's not great, but it's alright. It's also worth noting that it's not just pretty good when you're using her as a carry, it's also pretty good when you're using her in monopyro teams where you have another pyro character doing the damage. C2 is completely worthless, it doesn't do anything. C3 is kind of nice. It increases her Pyronado damage. Pyronado is her main source of damage. C4, though, is the big one, right? The C4 increases Pyronado damage much more than C3 does, because making it last longer is a pretty big deal. C3 and C4 compound on top of each other to make it so the difference between C2 and C4 Xiangling is pretty sizable. I think that Xiangling as a solo, like as a main carry for your team and a vape team is a lot harder to make work when you only have C2 or C1 or C0. She's still fine, and she's still, like, especially in like the monopyro teams or even in stuff like Raiden National, where while you are still reliant on Xiangling's damage, you have a bit more damage coming from other sources as well. Now, if you don't have C4 Xiangling, it's also very possible you also don't have other available characters, and she might still be the best option for you, but she's definitely not nearly as good. At C4 though, obviously, very strong unit. She's been strong ever since 1.0, a true mainstay in the meta. So yeah, while I think in early versions of Genshin, Xiangling was very much a must build if you wanted to have a strong account. Nowadays, she is just one of many options. That being said, you spawn with her on your account, so for most people, when you start at the very beginning, it's worth using her, and she has very good synergy with some other units that are actually 4 stars themselves. Very often, you'll have the possibility of making a strong Xiangling team with leftover units. In any case, C5 increases Guoba talent, best constellation in the game. Guoba, get them! No, it's not very good, but it is funny. I will say, Guoba does do a non-insignificant amount of damage. Like, Guoba actually does hurt, so it's still not completely useless, but it's definitely not the greatest. And then finally, for the duration of Pyronado, all party members receive a 15% power damage bonus. It applies after she already snapshot her stats for Pyronado, so she doesn't get it for her own Pyronado. It slightly increases Guoba's damage, but by less than C5, so obviously not that great for that. It's mostly a constellation that's nice for monopyro teams where you end up buffing your Lyney or your whatever. Obviously, Xiangling is a very good unit, but she's not really necessary for your account to be good anymore. So let's move on to the weapons. And honestly, man, this banner makes me sad. Arlecchino's signature is not a particularly versatile weapon right now. It is possible we get Bond of Life supports in the future, but because it relies on your character having Bond of Life, and right now, the only way of getting Bond of Life outside of a character's kit is from weapons, and you can't have those weapons and this weapon equipped at the same time. You can only trigger the damage percent passive on Arlecchino. That may be worth reevaluating once we get leaks on Xiangling, which should be a few days from now. We'll know if we're getting a way of giving Bond of Life to your character in 4.7. So I'll try to post a first impressions video that covers that. And if that's the case, then obviously this weapon can become a more versatile option that can be fine on any of the characters. But otherwise, right now, it's mainly just a weapon that is an okay-ish stat stick that effectively doesn't have a passive for most people. On Arlecchino herself, it's not that big of an increase over Jadewing Spear. It's an incredibly minor increase over Staff of Scarlet Sands and Vape teams. I think that the only real reason to consider going for Arlecchino's signature weapon, like even in a vacuum without looking at the banner, is either one, you think that she's unplayable without the cool scythe animations, which like honestly I think is the main reason people are gonna pull for this weapon, because it sure as fuck isn't gonna be because of its power. Or two, you don't have Jadewing Spear, you don't have another 5-star stat stick, and the best weapon you have available to you is like something like White Tassel, and you're planning on playing her in a team that doesn't use Bennett. Then yeah, the gap between your current best weapon and this weapon becomes pretty massive, and it can actually be a pretty big increase to go for it. That being said, in basically every other option, her weapon is worse than her early constellations, and early constellations are easier to get than her weapon. So I think for most people that are going to want to play her in her optimal teams, if you want to vertical invest into her, it's C1 before weapon, then C2 before weapon, and then maybe even C3 before weapon. Maybe weapon before C3, because once you reach C2, you have a lot more front-loaded damage that isn't from your normal attack talents, and the weapon can help you one rotate bosses a little bit faster than the C3 does. But even then, right, it's also generally harder to get the weapon than it is to get her C3. So just keep that in mind. For Lyney, it is actually a pretty good weapon, although, like I said earlier, I think stat stick bows are they're pretty damn good. And so even though Lyney's weapon is incredibly synergistic with him and gives him a lot of stats, because all the good 5-star bows give a lot of stats, if you already have a 5-star bow, it is possible that getting this weapon isn't going to be that insane of an increase. That being said, it is still his best weapon by a decent margin, and I think that there's a bit more of an argument to pull for his signature than there is to pull for Arlecchino's signature. However, the problem then becomes that Arlecchino's weapon, at least as of right now, is not very versatile, so losing your 37.5% to get the first Great Magic isn't gonna be very pog, and the 4-star lineup is awful. So let's talk about that. Favonius Warbow, by far the best 4-star on this banner. The main problem is that it doesn't have that many users, and you get one for free from completing the Mondstadt Archon quest. And so it's generally the one fav weapon Well, it's the one that you can assume everyone has, unless they're an idiot who used it as fodder, which, like, I am sorry to hear that if that's the case. But generally, basically everyone has. And while there are a few good users for it, they're generally not characters that are played in the same team, and they're also somewhat often characters that want to be played with similar characters. And so you end up relatively rarely needing to have two Fav bows at the same time. The refines on it also don't tend to matter that much. I mean, the main character it's used for is Yelan, and Yelan is obviously a damage dealer, so you're going to want to build crit on her anyways, so you're not really going to struggle with proccing it. Pharazon can get a decent amount of hits at C0 because you're going to have to stay on her to do a charge shot anyway. Goro is probably the one on which the refines matter the most, but even then you do have a couple hits. And then there's also the fact that C0 Pharazon doesn't really give a shit what her stats are. You're just looking for ER, which makes it a lot easier to find crit rate, right? It's not like she scales with something else, so you can just give her a crit rate circlet with as much ER as possible. And then on all of your other pieces, you can just look for ER and crit. It's not like any of those characters are like, for example, when you look at Kazuha, right? Kazuha can alleviate crit rate requirements for Fav through the fact that he has a lot of hits. But even then, you do still need to build a little bit of crit on him, right? And on him, it kind of sucks to have to build crit because a crit roll is not an EM or an ER roll. If you look at a character that, similar to Kazuha, has a specific stat they want to go for, but doesn't have multi-hits, like Yunjin, that's where Fav weapons start to become pretty rough and very reliant on refinement. Playing an R1 Fav Lance on Yunjin feels awful. You need so much crit rate. You need to stay on her for longer. It's not it. I don't recommend it. All this to say, Fav Warbow is the one Fav weapon you get for free, and generally the Fav weapon that's the least reliant on refinements to get its procs, which means that it's one of the least impactful Fav weapons to have on a banner. I'd argue Fav Greatsword also doesn't matter too much, but at least when it comes to Fav Greatsword, well, the other greatswords aren't great either, and it's not so much that it's bad to have, it's just that there's not a lot of characters that use it. So, the best weapon isn't even that great. Now let's look at the others. So, Dragon's Bane is not a bad weapon. The reality, though, is that you're realistically only really using this on 2 characters. Maybe 3 if you include Rosario in Rev Melt teams, but like, It's good for Raiden, but you don't need refines on it, and it's on every other weapon banner. You probably have R36 of it already. And it's good on Hu Tao, but other weapons are also good on Hu Tao. Yeah, I will say, Hu Tao is like the main character for which this weapon is relevant on weapon banners. But again, generally, when you're going on a weapon banner for one of your carries, Homa, like, just go Homa instead. You can use Homa on Arlecchino, fuck this shit. And I think people that are willing to consider weapon banner are generally willing to consider it for multiple characters. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's kind of worth mentioning. Dragon's Bane is deceptively dog shit on Arlecchino. You might think it's pretty good, and like, it's not necessarily bad. The main issue with Dragon's Bane on Arlecchino is that it has low base attack, and she's an attack scaler, so obviously the low base attack matters more on her than it does on a character like Hu Tao. But it's more so that Arlecchino doesn't want to build that much EM. Once you already have like 100-ish EM past that starts losing in value more and more. And because Dragon's Bane is low base attack, high substat, and its substat is EM, you're basically already starting with significantly worse value from your weapon substat, and also from any substats you get, or any external buffs like Instructor. Because of that, and because of the fact that Arlecchino gets a lot of damage percent, right? She gets 40% damage percent from her passive, she gets 54 from her set bonus, and she can get even more depending on what team you're playing her in. That also diminishes the value of the passive from Dragon's Bane. And so basically, every aspect of Dragon's Bane are less valuable on Arlecchino than they would be on other characters that take advantage of them better. That makes it so that even in vape teams where you are getting 100% uptime on the Dragon's Bane passive, often it's not even better than the free-to-play options. So for Arlecchino, this is not really good. The third best weapon on the banner is the Dog Hands Assistant. Dog Hands Assistant, it is a fake weapon, it is not real. It's nice to have an HP substat sword for Nilo, but the reality is that a lot of the popular Nilo teams don't have incredibly fast hydro application from their last unit, from their last slot, and you end up with Nilo's personal bloom triggers being a decent portion of the team's damage, which makes it so that just getting an EM weapon on Nilo isn't that much worse than an HP weapon. In other words, this is not a large upgrade over Iron Sting. What makes Key so good on Nilo is not the fact that it's an HP subset, although obviously that's helpful and that's part of it. But what makes Key so good is that it's actually just one of the best passives in the game. It gives an insane amount of EM to Nilo herself, while also giving a pretty big EM buff to the rest of the team. Key is generally the signature weapon that I consider to be the most impactful on the team you're going to use it in. There's other teams where like it's somewhat competitive when you're looking at like true hyper carry teams, or one character is doing all the damage and their signature weapon is like significantly better than the best option. But generally, those characters have other 5-star stat sticks that are not that much worse than the signature, which makes the gap between the best available option and the second best not that big. In Nilo teams, you don't have a second best available option that's like actually reasonably good. All in all, Dockhand's Assistant is like fine on Nilo, and if you actually do get it, you can use it on Nilo, and it is probably generally going to be better than Iron Sting, but not really significantly so. And again, right, if you're willing to pull on weapon banners, honestly, I think the Nilo team is going to benefit from it more than either an Arlecchino or a Lyney team. Portable Power Saw is awful, useless, doesn't have a good user. What is this weapon? I think they forgot to release HP scaling Claymore characters before they released this weapon. It's just useless. It's garbage. What? Like, it's straight up just like worthless. It's just straight up bad. It might be good eventually once we get characters that are released that scale well with it, but as of now, complete trash. Eye of Perception, also really bad. Eye of Perception is actually not that bad of an option in AoE scenarios on some carry catalyst characters if you are comparing it to like other free-to-play options. But honestly, with the release of the Fontaine craftable weapons, I think that the one use case Eye of Perception had is just gone. So, you have two weapons that are completely worthless, two weapons that can be minor upgrades to a few characters, but that's it, and one weapon that's good, but you're guaranteed to already have it, and that you don't need to have that many of. The 4-stars on this banner are truly, like, significantly below average. The 5-star weapons, my rating of Arlecchino's signature is somewhat reliant on whether or not we'll have good supports in the future that do apply enough Bond of Life to your own characters that you can get this passive on characters other than Arlecchino. On Arlecchino, it's a fine signature weapon, but it's worse than her constellations, so not really worth considering unless you've already gone for the major constellations, in which case, honestly, you probably don't even need the banner review. Lyney's bow, I think, is the main meta reason to consider going for this banner. It's a relatively versatile weapon, because it's just a decent stat stick, and it's just also, like, quite good on Lyney himself, but it's far from necessary. Lyney's C1 is also pretty reasonable, so it's not like the bow is inherently better than the constellation, and because this banner is so bad, and it's a little bit harder to get yourself a 5-star weapon than a 5-star character, then I would still probably go for early cons over this. Overall, my rating of this weapon banner is that it's one of the worst ones we've had. I think if you specifically are going for Arlecchino's signature because it looks cool, it's not as bad, because the Lyney bow is relatively useful. It's a good stat stick on a lot of bow characters, so it's still like fine to get. And you're not pulling for the Arlecchino signature because it's good, you're pulling for it because it's pretty. And in that case, then at least the two 5-stars are like things you're somewhat okay with getting. The 4-stars are still awful though. I think if you're someone who wants to go for Lyney's weapon, Arlecchino's weapon is one of the worst things you can get next to it. It's a stat stick. If you don't have a healer on your team, you get 12% damage bonus from the passive. If you have a healer, you don't get anything. If you're Arlecchino, you get 36 damage bonus. The thing is, just this 12% damage bonus is a worse passive than Jadewing Spear. So it's like, it's worse than a standard 5-star weapon as a stat stick, which is generally not a great sign. Unless they end up releasing Bond of Life supports in the future, definitely a pretty bad weapon to be like the secondary weapon on a banner you want to go for the other weapon. Yeah, I think if you wanted to get Lyney's bow, really disappointing banner. If you wanted to get Arlecchino's weapon specifically because it looks pretty, it's okay because at least the other 5-star is pretty decent. If you're considering going for a weapon over an early constellation, the 4 stars here are actually somehow worse than the 4 stars here. So I would go early constellations over weapons. And now for the character banners, also below average, right? 2 characters that aren't really good to have on banners. 1 character that is good if you don't already have her at C4, but one of the characters that the most amount of people will already have at C4. So it's alright if you don't have Xiangling at C4 already, otherwise it's a pretty bad banner. Overall, I'd go somewhat below average. Comparing them to the current banners, they're honestly relatively similar, I think, when it comes to the weapon banner. Freedom Sword is the equivalent of Arlecchino's signature. Not even. I don't know, man. On some characters, it's a fine stat stick. The 4 stars are worse. Like, these 4 stars are better than the upcoming 4 stars, and that's, I can't believe I'm saying that, but at least there's one weapon that's, like, actually useful. The 4-star lineup for the character banner, I think, is also worse for Arlecchino, because Xingqiu has more total relevant constellations that you want to get than Xiangling does, and the other 2 don't matter, just like the other 2 don't matter on the Arlecchino banner. And I think the 5 stars are also worse. Obviously, these 2 5 stars are pretty good. They're better than Arlecchino and Lyney. So I do think that the upcoming banners are a bit worse than the current ones. But yeah, I think that's going to be it for this banner review. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you do like the longer format. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.